Welcome to this explainer. We so often look at modern conflicts purely through the lens of geopolitics or maybe resources, but to really understand the roots of the current situation between Russia and Ukraine, we actually have to look backward. Today, we're unpacking how history itself has literally become a weapon. Both nations are using historical memory as a powerful tool to validate their present-day realities and ultimately their futures.
Let's kick things off with a pretty wild question. Why on earth is a modern, devastating war being justified by the legacy of a 10th century medieval prince? It sounds completely absurd, right? But figures who have been dead for literally 1,000 years are actively being used to shape the borders and identities of millions of people today. This is not just some dusty academic debate. It is the very ideological foundation of the whole crisis.
To map this all out, we're going to look at 5 key areas today. First, the memory war. Second, the debate over who actually owns Kievan Rus. Third, the 1654 Pereyaslav Treaty. Fourth, the language battleground. And finally, the declaration of state sovereignty.
But before we dive into the timeline, we really need to wrap our heads around a concept that historian Timothy Snyder calls the politics of eternity. Essentially, it's the belief that a people share an unchanging, eternal historical essence. From Moscow's perspective, Eastern Slavs, so Russians, Ukrainians, and Belarusians, share this deep-seated, eternal unity. And because of that worldview, any distinct, separate Ukrainian identity isn't seen as a natural evolution. Instead, it's viewed as foreign manipulation or an anti-Russia project.
Okay, moving to our first major flashpoint. Who owns Kievan Rus and the battle for the 9th century? When you think about the vast spans of time involved here, it's really eye-opening. From the 9th to the 13th centuries, Kiev Rus was this massive, loose federation of principalities. But after the Mongol invasions completely destroyed Kiev in 1240, the whole region fractured. Over the next several centuries, the lands that make up modern Ukraine fell under Polish-Lithuanian influence, while the lands to the northeast coalesced around Moscow. So we're talking about a shared origin, sure, but followed by centuries of entirely divergent paths.
Now, the Russian state heavily uses the 10th century figure of Vladimir the Great to cement a narrative of absolute spiritual unity. To put that into perspective, back in 2016, a massive statue of him was unveiled right next to the Kremlin. Moscow's narrative emphasizes that his adoption of Orthodox Christianity way back in 988 created this unbroken civilizational thread running directly from medieval Kiev straight to modern-day Moscow.
And right here is where we see the memory war in full swing. While Moscow claims Vladimir is the ultimate unifier of a Russian-led Orthodox civilization, Kiev claims him as a European-leaning founding father. In Ukraine, he's actually been on their currency for a long time and has had a statue standing in Kiev since 1853. They argue his adoption of Byzantine Christianity was a definitive European choice, which oriented the state toward the broader European community and planted the roots of an independent Ukrainian nation.
But this clash of memory is definitely not new. Way back in 1904, historian Mikhailo Grushevsky fiercely argued that Kievan Rus was an entirely Ukrainian state, and that Russia emerged completely separately up in the northern forests. By tracing Ukraine's legacy through the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth and the Cossack Hetmanate, he directly challenged the old imperial view that just treated Ukrainian history as a mere subset of a much larger Russian story.
Let's jump forward to our second flashpoint, the 1654 Pereyaslav Treaty, which is essentially a 368-year-old dispute.
Moscow frequently points to historical primary sources, like a famous letter from 1654, to argue that Ukrainians and Russians have always defined themselves as one single people. Here's the context for that. Orthodox Cossacks in Ukraine were staging a massive uprising against the Catholic Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. Feeling desperate and finding themselves without any reliable allies, the Cossack leader Bogdan Khmelnytsky turned to the Russian Tsar for help, and that resulted in the Pereyaslav Treaty.
So, we have the exact same historical document, but completely opposite realities. Russia views this treaty as a joyous, permanent reunification of divided lands. But Ukrainian historians, well, they see it as a desperate, temporary military pact that Moscow later exploited to swallow up Ukrainian autonomy and enforce imperial rule. It's literally one signature sparking 2 centuries-old arguments.
All right, moving to part 3, the language battleground and the ethno-linguistic divide.
Today, nearly 64% of the country considers Ukrainian to be their native language. But honestly, that number hides a heavily layered history. Under Tara's rule, the Ukrainian language was actively banned from schools and publications.
Then later, Soviet industrialization pushed a heavy Russian influence into eastern urban centers, cementing Russian as the go-to language for elite business and science.
Because of that history, actual daily usage is deeply split. Nearly a quarter of the population seamlessly switches between both languages, totally depending on the situation. It creates a fascinating reality where many Ukrainians are fiercely politically aligned with an independent Ukraine, but that culturally and linguistically operate in Russian. It completely defies neat, simplistic borders. Legislative attempts to manage this complex bilingual reality, like the 2012 language law, honestly only poured gas on the fire. By allowing any language spoken by 10% of a region to become an official regional language, critics saw a deliberate loophole. They argued it wasn't really about protecting minority rights at all, but rather a tool for post-Soviet bureaucrats to entrench Russian monolingualism and slowly push Ukrainian out of major economic and political hubs.
And that brings us to Section 4, declaring state sovereignty and the legal breakaway of 1990.
In July 1990, the Ukrainian parliament passed a sweeping declaration asserting their absolute right to self-determination. This was a monumental pivot. Remember, this happened over a year before the Soviet Union officially dissolved. Ukraine was already actively drafting the legal blueprint to completely sever its historical orbit from Moscow.
The scope of this declaration was staggering. They weren't just asking for a bit of cultural autonomy. They claimed exclusive rights to all wealth, land, and resources within their borders. They demanded their own independent banking system, their own internal security, and their own armed forces. It was a complete constitutional rejection of Moscow's entire shared destiny narrative.
So, unpacking all of this, we can clearly see that this conflict isn't just a fight over territory. It's a profound collision of two entirely incompatible realities. For Moscow, history is an unbroken chain of unity, stretching from a 10th century baptism through a 17th century treaty, all the way to a modern shared culture. But for Kyiv, history is a distinct, European-leaning identity that survived centuries of subjugation, language suppression, and forced assimilation, all to finally reclaim its rightful independence.
I want to leave you with this final thought. When the battlefield is the past itself, how does a conflict like this ever truly end? You can redraw borders on a map, and you can definitely sign ceasefires, but you cannot negotiate an agreement on who owned a medieval empire or what a document from 1654 actually meant. Thanks for joining me for this explainer, and keep questioning the history behind the headlines.